Ready to start? Okay. I'm Detective Burbank with the Austin Police Department, Highway Enforcement, leading the scene unit. Last Tuesday, a little after 10 p.m., officers received call of a bicyclist that had been struck by a vehicle. As officers were responding, witnesses followed the vehicle, located the victim who had been drugged approximately a half a mile, a little less than that, by the vehicle before it left the scene. Officers arrived on scene, directed EMS and fire in to treat the victim, and she was immediately transported to the hospital. Officers conducted their investigation that evening, marked down, the critical spots of the incident with paint for the further follow-up investigation. And then at the end of the shift that next morning, one of the officers who had worked the crime scene that night was on his way home in his personal vehicle and observed what he believed to be the suspect vehicle. His suspicions were confirmed. He followed it for a while. Officers called for on-duty officers to follow. The on-duty officers caught up with them just south of the city limits on I-35 and made the stop. The on-duty officers on scene ended up conducting an interview with the suspect. Based on those responses that he had, the suspect was brought to the Highway Enforcement Office, where he was questioned by detectives on multiple times throughout the day. Some follow-up investigation was done with interviews with another household member of the suspect. Confronted the suspect with some inconsistencies in his story, and he eventually did make some admissions that eventually led to his arrest. He was charged with failed to stop an underage. It's a third-degree felony due to the serious injury of the nature of the injuries. And the suspect is still in custody as far as I know, and the victim is still in the hospital. I'm going to turn it over to Sergeant Wright, who was the supervisor on scene that night.
Hello, I'm Sergeant Matthew Wright. I work in Region 3 Patrol. Specifically, I supervise the Charlie 700s. Two of the officers that I supervise were involved in investigating the crash and also in the apprehension, and the assistance in the apprehension of the suspect. And they are Officer Paul Bianchi and Officer Andy Traylor. I just wanted to make a quick statement on how proud I am of these officers and the work that they did that night. And for Andy specifically, and the work that he did while off duty going home, being able to think on his feet, identify a suspect, and lead to the apprehension of the suspect of this gruesome crash. And I just want to let everyone know that this is really just a small portion of the great work that they do day in and day out, or night in and night out, since we work the night shift. It's pretty much indicative of the work that they do each and every day. So right now I'll turn it over to Officer Paul Bianchi, who was the first officer on the scene and identified the victim and her injuries.
Senior Police Officer Paul Bianchi. Senior Police Officer Paul Bianchi. I was one of the first ones on scene. There was another officer that had arrived on scene at MLK Airport. That was the initial call of the actual crash. All they found was an actual bicycle. Call update stated that the victim had been drugged to Greenwood Avenue. So I was the first one on scene at Greenwood Avenue with Officer Hauser, who's not here right now. Initial observation, when I pulled up, she was laying in the middle of the road with a white blanket over on top of her. Some of the witnesses that had seen her being drugged for over 2,000 feet had followed the suspect until she had been dropped onto the middle of the road. They stayed with her and covered her with a blanket due to the extent of her injuries. I ran over with my medical kit thinking that I could possibly do something for her there on scene. I removed the sheet itself, and when I saw that her spine and her pelvis was exposed, I knew that there was nothing that I could do in any of the training that I had to take care of her at that point. I immediately called for EMS stating that there was life-threatening injuries for the victim. At that point, EMS arrived on scene and was able to take the victim to the hospital. At that point, I locked down the scene and took care of all the witnesses and their statements. All the witnesses that actually viewed the actual crash, they're the heroes as well. They stayed with the suspect. They blew red lights, ran through stop signs to try to stop this individual. And it's really the community that really took care of the victim today. We were ones that just responded due to a phone call. At that point in time, we were able to take care of the scene, and we noticed that there was evidence for 2,000 feet of the victim's clothing and pieces of skin that was along the roadway from her injuries. So at that point in time, I wrote my observations, took witness statements, and held the scene until it was released.
I'm Officer Andy Traylor. I responded at the same time that we received a 911 call. I was a little further out. Based on the description that was given of the suspect vehicle we had was just a white Dodge truck at this point. I took an angle that I thought might be beneficial to possibly intercept him if he would have went northbound, which ultimately he ended up going northbound on Greenwood. I searched the area for several minutes looking for the suspect vehicle and wasn't able to locate it. At that time, I was listening to the radio traffic for the nature of the injuries and knew that we were going to have to shut down the roadway. And I knew that I was going to end up taking over the investigation as far as the crash is concerned for the actual crash itself. So I responded to the scene, I assisted with shutting down the roadway, and then I took over the actual crash investigation. Normally with a crash, we just interview these people, and if it's a minor collision, minor injuries, we give them the paperwork and we do the crash report. Based on the seriousness of it and the possibility that it was life-threatening evidence, which there's about a 2,000-foot stretch of debris from her belongings and portions of where you could tell she had been drugged. Once I documented all that, I assisted with keeping the scene secured until we were instructed to release the scene. Once we released the scene, myself and Officer Bianchi actually took it upon ourselves. We spent another probably 2 hours checking every apartment complex, every neighborhood, side streets, anywhere we could possibly look to find what we had ultimately given was a white Dodge Ram with a camper or possibly an older Ford Bronco and the license plate of FYY. So we spent the better part of 2 hours looking for that with no luck. After we got done with that, I was dispatched to another call, which was irrelevant, but that call led to me getting off late that morning. As I was getting off work, I checked my phone and saw that there was traffic on my normal route, so I took a route that I never take, and I ended up going to Bastrop Highway, which is US 183 southbound. And as I was southbound, I looked up on the Montopolis Bridge, and 2 cars in front of me, I observed a older model Dodge Ram with what appeared to be a camper on it. I found it kind of coincidental that I would see that on my way home based on the crash. So I got behind that vehicle and observed the license plate was FFY, which was very similar to the description of the plate we were given of FYY. At this point, I kind of had a gut feeling that this might possibly be our suspect. So I called our dispatcher and had her run the license plate. She ran the license plate and the registered address came back to an address off of FM 969, which would be the correct route if you were to go eastbound on MLK, which turns into 969. So I let dispatch know at this point I was going to get off the phone and attempt to just pass the vehicle and see if there was any damage consistent with the front end. I hung up the phone, went around the vehicle, and observed that it had some pretty significant front end damage on the front passenger side. At this point, with all the the plate, the description, and the damage, I was almost 100% positive this was going to be our suspect vehicle. I got back behind the vehicle and just continued traveling with him as he was making his way to ultimately what ended up being on 35. I let dispatch know that this was probably going to be our suspect vehicle from the collision the night before and asked for some on-duty units to come and make a stop on this vehicle. It was in the morning time during our shift change, so it took a little bit to get some units to me. Like I said, I ultimately followed the vehicle to just south of the city limits, right in the Blvd area. The suspect definitely knew that I was back there at some point because I had initiated my hazard lights so that it would be easier for the responding officers to find me. Never made anything evasive, but definitely was changing lanes to see where I would do and where I would go. I continued following him until ultimately, I forget the exact block range, but on-duty patrol units arrived and were able to make a traffic stop on the vehicle. Once they got the stop conducted and I saw that they had the suspect detained, I went my way back there and kind of briefed them on the crash. I think their supervisor had already done a little bit, but I briefed them on what had happened and why I thought this was going to be the suspect. Left them with my information, and then ultimately I continued on my way home and received a call a couple hours later informed me that this was going to be the suspect vehicle and that ultimately the suspect had admitted that he was involved in that collision. So it was like I said, it was a very kind of bittersweet feeling to know that at least we found the guy, but to have to see those injuries that she sustained and know that her life's forever changed was, like I said, it was bittersweet, but it was somewhat comforting to know that some justice was served for her. And that was pretty much my involvement in this.
At this time, you guys will take questions.
Just the officer that we just heard from, sorry, I came out of nowhere. Hi, Elizabeth Salvage Fox. You said that it was, obviously bittersweet that you had recognized the guy, the truck, but, you know, obviously this is something she'll have to live with for the rest of her life. But how integral was that witness's partial plate? And, I mean, it's incredible that you happen to be working the case and you were the one that recognized this car while you were driving on your way home.
If we wouldn't have had that plate and ultimately that description of an older Dodge with a camper, which really kind of narrowed it down, I would have probably never even paid attention to that vehicle going home. Like, I would have taken my normal route and probably drove right by that. But based on the fact that it was just this blatantly obvious white older model Dodge with a camper on it, and then to have a plate that similar based on the witnesses' descriptions, I felt it was too coincidental that it was just some random vehicle. So, you know, we get those gut instincts sometimes where you just have to kind of go with it. And at that point, like, something was telling me that this was probably going to be our suspect, and that's why I did a little bit more investigating while I continued to follow him.
Is it fair to say that, you know, you guys all take your work home with you every day? I mean, you were, again, on your way home, you could have clocked out and not paid attention to what you had seen two cars in front of you.
Well, it's kind of like the thing they tell us is that, you know, we're always on duty. I mean, it takes a certain kind of person to do this job. It takes a certain kind of calling for someone to want to do this job. Yeah, I could have very easily just said, nah, it's a white truck, but I'm on my way home. But it would have been no justice for her. I mean, working that crash scene, seeing an innocent person get drove 2,000 feet, who was 2 blocks from their house, was, like I said, that was probably one of the more gruesome scenes I've ever had to work, especially in the crash aspect of it. So it's just the right thing to do at that point. Like, I had to do something. I had to take some form of action.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Good job, guys.